3 days ago, the most powerful executive on earth lost a case he almost certainly knew he would lose. 6-3. That is the final tally from the Supreme Court in Trump versus Barbara. Birthright citizenship stands. And right now, most of the internet is reacting in one of two ways, either celebration or outrage. Both reactions are missing the point. This was not a surprise defeat. This was not a legal miscalculation. And this is definitely not the end of the story, because buried inside that ruling is a single concurring opinion from Justice Kavanaugh that may have just handed congressional Republicans the most uncomfortable question of their careers. And it is a question that splits them right down the middle. To understand what just happened 3 days ago, you need to understand what has been true for 158 years. In 1868, the United States ratified the 14th Amendment. Section 1 contains what legal scholars call the Citizenship Clause. It reads, and I am quoting directly, "All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside." That single sentence was written for a very specific reason. It was designed to overrule one of the most infamous Supreme Court decisions in American history. Dred Scott versus Sanford, 1857. In that case, the court ruled that black Americans, whether free or enslaved, were not citizens. They were, in the court's own words, a separate class of persons. The 14th Amendment was the direct response, a constitutional guarantee that citizenship would be determined by where you were born, not who your parents were, not what race you belonged to, not whether someone in power approved of your existence. 30 years later, the Supreme Court reinforced that guarantee in a case called United States versus Wong Kim Ark, decided in 1898. Wong Kim Ark was born in San Francisco to Chinese immigrant parents. He traveled to China to visit family. When he returned, immigration officials refused to let him back in, claiming he was not a citizen. The Supreme Court disagreed. Born on American soil, subject to American law. That made him American. Full stop. Now here is a detail most people do not know. During World War II, the United States government detained Japanese nationals as enemy aliens in internment camps on American soil. And yet, babies born inside those camps were automatically granted United States citizenship. Even at the peak of wartime hostility, the principle held. That is how deeply embedded birthright citizenship has been in American law. Then in 1952, Congress passed the Immigration and Nationality Act, which codified this principle into federal statute. Specifically, Title 8, United States Code, Section 1401A. That statute says that a person born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof is a citizen at birth. So birthright citizenship was not just a constitutional principle, it became written law as well, 2 layers of legal protection. Constitutional and statutory. Keep that distinction in mind. It matters enormously for what comes later. Now, for decades, birthright citizenship was politically controversial but legally untouchable. Politicians debated it. Commentators argued about it, but no president had ever directly challenged it through executive action. That changed on January 20th, 2025. On his first day back in office for a second term, President Trump signed an executive order that attempted to deny automatic citizenship to children born in the United States if both parents were either in the country illegally or on temporary visas. The order was scheduled to take effect 30 days later. It never did. Federal judges across the country blocked it almost immediately. Every single lower court that reviewed the order concluded it was unconstitutional. One judge called it, and I quote, blatantly unconstitutional. What followed was 17 months of legal maneuvering. In June of 2025, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 in a separate case, Trump versus Casa, that lower courts generally cannot issue nationwide injunctions. That was a procedural win for the administration. Then a federal judge in New Hampshire issued a narrower injunction protecting a specific class of affected children. The Trump administration appealed directly to the Supreme Court, skipping the appeals court entirely. The court agreed to hear the case in December of 2025. Oral arguments ran for 2 full hours on April 1st of this year. And then, 3 days ago, on June 30th, the ruling came down. But here is the thing most headlines got wrong. They reported 6-3. Clean and simple. The reality is far more complicated than that, and the complication is exactly where the real story begins. Let me break down what actually happened inside that courtroom. 5 justices signed onto Chief Justice Roberts' majority opinion. Roberts, joined by Kagan, Sotomayor, Barrett, and Jackson. Their reasoning was constitutional. The 14th Amendment guarantees birthright citizenship. The executive order violated it. Case closed. 3 justices dissented outright. Thomas wrote a 91-page dissent, joined by Gorsuch, arguing that the Citizenship Clause only applies to people domiciled in the United States, not just physically present. Domiciled, meaning permanent residents with fixed homes and legal ties. Alito filed a separate dissent along similar lines. Roberts called their historical reasoning revisionist. Now, here is where it gets interesting. Justice Kavanaugh, he voted to block Trump's executive order. That is why the headline reads 6-3. But he refused to join the constitutional reasoning of the majority. His basis was entirely different. Kavanaugh said the executive order violated a federal statute, specifically 8 United States Code, Section 14, 01A, the 1952 law I mentioned earlier. In his view, that statute currently grants birthright citizenship, and the president cannot override a statute by executive order. But then Kavanaugh added something that changed the entire equation. He wrote, and this is a direct quote, "Congress could, consistent with the 14th Amendment, amend Section 1401A or otherwise enact new legislation establishing exceptions to birthright citizenship for children born to foreign citizens unlawfully or temporarily in the country." But Congress has not yet done so. Read that again carefully. Kavanaugh is saying Congress has the authority to rewrite this law, not through a constitutional amendment, through regular legislation. He is drawing a map, and he is handing it to Capitol Hill. Think of it this way. Imagine a football game that ends 6-3. Looks like a clear win for one side, but one of the 6 players on the winning team turns around and says, "I scored for your side today, but only because the current rulebook says I have to. Change the rulebook and I am playing for the other team next time." That is Kavanaugh, which means the real margin on the constitutional question was not 6-3, it was 5-4, 1 vote. Trump came within a single vote of overturning 128 years of settled precedent. Now, within minutes of the ruling, Trump posted on Truth Social. His message was clearly prepared in advance. He wrote that the ruling was, in his words, too bad for the country. But then he pivoted immediately. He called on Congress to pass legislation to end birthright citizenship and added, "No long and unwieldy constitutional amendment is necessary. Congress should start today." That pivot was not emotional, it was operational. Some political analysts observed that the speed and specificity of the statement suggest the legislative push was planned well before the ruling came down. Others caution this could simply be standard political messaging, reframing a loss as an opportunity. Both readings are plausible. What is not debatable is the effect. Because within the hour, the Republican Party began splitting in real time. On one side, senators like Rand Paul, Mike Lee, and Eric Schmidt called for a constitutional amendment. Paul had already filed draft language back in April. Lee posted on X within minutes. Schmidt announced his own amendment proposal the same afternoon. On the other side, Trump and House Speaker Mike Johnson signaled a preference for the legislative route. Johnson told reporters, and I quote, "I do not know what the best path forward is." 2 factions, 2 strategies, 1 party, and a president applying pressure from the outside. Now, here is the part almost nobody is talking about yet. Both paths have serious structural problems, and understanding exactly why is the key to understanding what Trump just did to the Republicans who refuse to fall in line. Let us start with the numbers, because numbers do not have opinions. According to the Migration Policy Institute, approximately 255,000 children are born every year in the United States to parents who are not citizens. Over a decade, that is roughly 2.5 million people. That is not a rounding error. That is a demographic force. But here is what most commentators miss. If birthright citizenship were actually restricted, the verification burden would not fall only on those 255,000 births, it would fall on every single birth in the country. Roughly 3.6 million babies are born in the United States each year. Every one of them would need parental status verification before receiving citizenship documentation. A birth certificate alone would no longer be sufficient proof. The federal government itself acknowledged this. Agencies had already drafted guidelines for a new citizenship determination process tied to parental legal status. Think about that for a moment. 3.6 million verifications per year. That is not a policy tweak. That is a new federal bureaucracy. Now let us examine the two paths forward that are currently tearing the Republican Party apart. Path 1. Constitutional amendment. This is the route being pushed by Rand Paul, Mike Lee, Eric Schmidt, and Ron DeSantis. Paul's proposal would limit automatic birthright citizenship to children with at least one parent who is either a United States citizen, a lawful permanent resident, or an active duty service member. On paper, it sounds straightforward. In practice, it is nearly impossible. A constitutional amendment requires 2/3 of the Senate, that is 67 votes, 2/3 of the House, that is 290 votes, and then ratification by 3/4 of all state legislatures, that is 38 out of 50 states. In the entire history of the United States, only 27 amendments have been ratified in 235 years. The most recent one, the 27th Amendment, was ratified in 1992, 34 years ago, and that amendment was originally proposed in 1789. It took 202 years to get across the finish line. Here is the cold math. Republicans currently hold 53 seats in the Senate. They would need 67. That means they would need at least 14 Democratic senators to cross the aisle. In the current political environment, that number might as well be 1,400. Every major Democratic figure celebrated the ruling. Senator Alex Padilla of California called it one decision the Supreme Court actually got right. A constitutional amendment is not a strategy. It is a bumper sticker, and some observers believe that is exactly the point. That certain senators are proposing an amendment precisely because they know it will never happen. It allows them to appear aligned with the base while avoiding any action that might actually succeed. That is a political interpretation, not a proven fact. But it is one that several right-wing commentators are already making publicly. Now, Path 2, federal legislation. This is Trump's preferred route. It is also the route that Kavanaugh's concurrence appears to support. The logic goes like this. Congress passed a statute in 1952 that codified birthright citizenship. Congress can amend or replace that statute. Simple majority in both chambers or 60 votes in the Senate if the filibuster stays intact, and the president signs it into law. Faster, simpler, fewer moving parts. But there is a problem that almost no one in the pro-legislation camp is addressing publicly. The Supreme Court's majority opinion in Trump versus Barbara was not based on the statute. It was based on the Constitution. 5 justices ruled that the 14th Amendment itself guarantees birthright citizenship. That means, even if Congress passes a new law restricting it, that law would almost certainly face an immediate legal challenge. And based on the constitutional reasoning the majority just laid out 3 days ago, there is a very strong argument that the court would strike that law down too, unless the composition of the court changes. And that is the third variable nobody wants to say out loud. The constitutional majority was 5 justices. If any one of them leaves the bench through retirement, health, or any other reason, and is replaced by a justice who agrees with the Kavanaugh or Thomas position, the math flips. 5-4 becomes 4-5. A future case could produce the opposite result. So federal legislation may not be a solution today, but it could become one tomorrow, depending on who is sitting on that bench. Now step back and look at this from 30,000 feet. This is where the rhino problem comes into focus. Trump has effectively created a 3-option test for every Republican in Congress. Option 1, support a constitutional amendment, safe-sounding but structurally impossible, and increasingly seen by the base as a dodge. Option 2, support federal legislation, and, by extension, support changing Senate rules to pass it with a simple majority. Effective on paper, but it means confronting the filibuster, something many traditional Republicans view as a sacred institutional guardrail. Option 3, do nothing and hope the issue fades. Every option carries a cost. Choose the amendment path, and the America First base accuses you of running out the clock. Choose the legislative path, and you are forced to answer whether you support eliminating the filibuster, a question that splits the caucus in half. Choose silence, and you become a primary target in the next election cycle. There is no clean exit, and that is not an accident. Whether by design or by instinct, Trump has converted a legal defeat into an internal loyalty test, a mechanism that forces every Republican lawmaker to publicly declare where they stand, not on a symbolic vote, but on a structural question about how far they are willing to go. The term some analysts use for this is strategic forcing function. You create a situation where inaction is just as revealing as action, where the absence of a position becomes a position itself. But this analysis comes with a necessary caveat. Not everyone reads the situation this way. It is entirely possible that Trump simply lost at the Supreme Court and is now improvising the best political recovery he can. Skilled politicians do this routinely. The difference between a master plan and effective damage control is often invisible from the outside. What is visible and what is not debatable is the result. The Republican Party is now publicly divided on strategy, on procedure, and on how far to push. And that division is happening 5 months before a midterm election, which brings us to the part of this story that extends far beyond American domestic politics. Pull the lens back, way back. The United States is one of roughly 30 countries in the world that practices unrestricted jus soli, right of the soil. You are born here, you are a citizen. Most of those countries are in the Americas: Canada, Brazil, Mexico, Argentina. In Europe, almost no country does this anymore. The United Kingdom abandoned unrestricted birthright citizenship in 1983. France tightened its rules in 1993. Australia ended automatic jus soli in 2007. The global trend for the past 4 decades has been moving away from unconditional birthright citizenship, not toward it. So when the United States Supreme Court reaffirms the principle in 2026, it is not just a domestic ruling, it is a signal to the rest of the world. And different audiences are reading that signal very differently. For countries like Canada, which shares a land border with the United States and also practices jus soli, this ruling reduces pressure. If the United States had restricted birthright citizenship, Canadian policymakers would have faced immediate questions about whether they should follow. That pressure is now off, at least for the moment. For governments in Europe and Asia that have already moved to jus sanguinis systems, citizenship by blood rather than by soil, the ruling reinforces their view that the American model is an outlier, an anomaly rooted in post-Civil War history that most modern democracies have moved past. And then there is the phenomenon that several Republican senators specifically named in their reactions: birth tourism. Senator Mike Lee called it an exploitation of loopholes by, in his words, China's Communist Party members. Senator Schmidt called it a national crisis. Birth tourism is real, it exists, but its scale is debated. Estimates range from roughly 30,000 to 40,000 births per year linked to birth tourism, depending on whose numbers you use. In a country with 3.6 million annual births, that is roughly 1%. Whether that constitutes a crisis or a manageable policy issue depends entirely on your political framework. The data supports both arguments. Now, here is the structural consequence that matters most for anyone watching global power dynamics. This ruling established a clear boundary on presidential power. The Supreme Court said, in no uncertain terms, that the President of the United States cannot use an executive order to override a constitutional guarantee. That may sound obvious, but it has not been tested this directly in modern history. Combined with the court's earlier ruling in Trump versus Casa in June of 2025, which limited the power of lower courts to issue nationwide injunctions, you now have a new legal corridor. The presidency is procedurally stronger, federal courts are procedurally weaker. But when the president runs directly into the Constitution, the wall holds. That framework applies to every future president, not just this one. Every executive order on immigration, on civil liberties, on federal authority will now be measured against the boundary that Trump versus Barbara just drew. And here is the irony that almost no one has pointed out. By pushing this case all the way to the Supreme Court and losing, the Trump administration may have actually strengthened the very constitutional provision it was trying to weaken. Before this ruling, Birthright citizenship rested on a 128-year-old precedent. Now it rests on a 128-year-old precedent plus a fresh 2026 reaffirmation. The wall did not just hold, it got thicker. So, where does this leave us? 3 days ago, the Supreme Court did not end the fight over birthright citizenship. It relocated it, from the courtroom to the floor of Congress, and from Congress to every Republican primary ballot in the country. The midterm elections are 5 months away. Every Republican candidate running in a primary this November will now face a question that did not exist 18 months ago. Where do you stand, amendment or legislation? And if legislation, are you willing to change the Senate rules to make it happen? There is no safe answer. Meanwhile, the legislative calendar is ticking. Congress just left for the Independence Day recess. When they return, the pressure will be immediate. Will any actual bill be introduced? Or will this remain what it has been for 158 years, a debate that generates heat but no law? And then there is the variable that sits above everything else, the composition of the Supreme Court. 5 justices held the constitutional line 3 days ago. If even one of those 5 is replaced by a justice who aligns with the Kavanaugh or Thomas position, the entire calculus changes. Not in theory, in practice. So here is what I want you to think about. And I mean genuinely think about, not react to. Is Trump playing a long game, using a predictable legal loss to restructure the internal politics of his own party for the next decade? Or is this simply a defeated executive order being repurposed into campaign rhetoric? The evidence supports both readings, and the honest answer is that we will not know which one it is until we see what happens in November. That is the question I want you to answer in the comments. If this analysis gave you something the headlines did not, subscribe. We will be tracking this story as Congress returns and the primary season heats up.